Welcome, everyone. We are here today to discuss white supremacy and white women in the nonprofit sector for Healing Equity United's free webinar. So to get started, we would like to take some time to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we're on, despite the fact that we're meeting in a virtual space. We start off this way to express gratitude and appreciation to those territories we are residing on, and as a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. It's important that we understand the longstanding history that has brought us here and seek to understand our place within that history, whether we came here by choice or were forcefully brought to this country. And so Healing Equity United is on the lands of the Muwakma, Ohlone, Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish Territory lands. It's critical that we take a moment to recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands, and the deliberate and systemic destruction of their communities and culture, which still happens today. Over 100 million Indigenous people were slaughtered in the Western Hemisphere over the past 500 years. Today, there are only 6.8 million Indigenous folks left in the US. Please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present, and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. We encourage you to look up the lands that you are on, and I'll drop a link in the chat in a moment to support you if you need help in that. Educate yourself about the communities that are native to your land, share your learnings with others, and take action to support those local Indigenous communities when you can. And so we invite you now, if you'd like to honor the lands that you're on by entering their names into the chat. And if you need some support in finding the lands that you're zooming in from, there's a link in the chat.
Hello, everyone. Healing Equity United would like to genuinely welcome you into the space. We welcome people of all genders, including people who are women, men, trans, gender, queer, or others. We welcome people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islanders, European descent, those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, people indigenous to this land, and people of mixed and multiple descents. We also welcome all the languages that you might bring into this space: Spanish, English, indigenous languages, sign language, etc. We welcome people of different class backgrounds: working class, middle class, owning class, or those of us who aren't sure where we might fit on the class spectrum. We welcome people who are currently struggling to access resources necessary for survival, like affordable health care, adequate housing, reliable transportation, childcare, and so on, as well as people who currently have more access to those resources. We welcome people with disabilities, visible or invisible. We welcome people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others for whom none of those labels might fit. We welcome your bodies and the different ways that you might experience yours. Might include chronic pain, strength, tension, etc. We welcome survivors. We welcome people who currently identify as activists and people who do not. We welcome the single, married, partnered, those in dating relationships that are monogamous or polyamorous. We welcome those who are sexually active and those who are not. People who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. We welcome the wide range of emotions that you might bring into this space: joy and bliss, grief, rage, indignation, contentment, disappointment. We welcome people of different faiths, religious traditions, faith practices, private practices that don't belong to a tradition, agnostics, atheists, and seekers. And finally, we welcome people who have been to sessions like these in the past and those who have not. So, most genuinely, from everyone associated with Healing Equity United to each and every one of you, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Fiona. We would also like to take some time to acknowledge March as Gender Equality Month. Many of us are probably aware or refer to March as Women's History Month, but it's important that we acknowledge Gender Equality Month as well. And so this serves as a call to celebrate the history, contributions, and wellness of community members who are impacted by gender-based bias and oppression. We honor and uplift the livelihoods of all transgender, non-binary, and other gender diverse folks, including women and girls, this month and every day of the year. And so we honor the visibility and awareness of the LGBTQIA Two-Spirit Plus communities while acknowledging that it is not safe for many people to live openly as their authentic selves. We know that there are currently over 400 pieces of legislation that are impacting particularly the trans community at the moment. And so we encourage you to research and support your local grassroots organizations supporting the LGBTQIA Two-Spirit Plus communities, and again, those impacted by gender-based bias and oppression. We'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge Cesar Chavez Day coming up on March 31st. We honor Cesar Chavez's legacy as an educator, environmentalist, and civil rights leader. Farm workers and laborers across the country continue to struggle for livable wages and fair treatment. We encourage you to learn more and support farm workers. And there's a resource that we'll drop a link in the chat for you to check that out. And again, also research your local organizations that are supporting immigrant and migrant farm workers in your area. And so with that, my colleagues and I would like to take a moment to introduce ourselves as facilitators, and we're going to do that by sharing some of the identity markers that we come into the space with that helps to inform the work that we do. And so we'll dive into a little bit about ourselves that you might not find on a LinkedIn profile or a resume. And so, hi, everyone. My name is Cassie Whitebread. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a queer, second-generation Chinese American. I also identify as mixed race or biracial, as I have a white father. I was born in the state of New Jersey and grew up in a small town in central Jersey. I also spent some time in Philadelphia. I'm a first-gen college student, and I received my master's in education and used to be a middle school science teacher. And so I wear that educator hat in all the spaces that I occupy. I currently, though, live in Seattle, Washington. I've been out here for 7 years now. I live with my dog and my partner, who's pictured here, who identifies as a cisgender Black male who works in housing and homelessness in Seattle. And so that's a little bit about me. I will pass it over to Fiona.
Hello, everyone. I'm a first generation Jamaican American. Folks in my family range from being completely undocumented to naturalized citizens. So, the types of oppression that immigrants face, particularly undocumented immigrants, face, was a very tangible and real life experience that we had to navigate. Having said that, I'm a US citizen, and there's a lot of power and privilege in that identity. Um, I always ask myself how I might leverage it to be in solidarity with immigrants. Underneath the American flag, you'll see scales of justice. I am an attorney barred in New York and DC. And even though I don't currently practice law, I have to recognize that that identity causes a reaction for some folks. And on the one hand, it might grant my experiences and perspectives more valuable. And on the other hand, it might alienate folks because, lawyers are perceived in a variety of derogatory ways in terms of power over and talking down to people and being condescending and things like that. Next to the scales of justice is the Big Apple. I'm from the South Bronx in New York City, a community that's primarily Black and brown, has higher rates of drug use, of poverty, of criminal activity, and higher rates of love, support, and resilience that has helped to form my identity. And last but not least, there's a picture of my family to the left. I am married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. We talk about the fact that his immigration story is nothing like anybody else's in my family. We talk about his whiteness, his maleness, his white maleness, and how it all impacts how he moves through society. We have three biracial children, half Black, half white, the eldest of whom, the one standing next to my husband, identifies as a Black woman with a white father, because that most aptly captures her lived experience in this society. Jess?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jess, and I identify as a first-generation immigrant. I was born in the British colony of Hong Kong, came to the US when I was about 4 years old. My parents were blue-collar workers and didn't speak much English, and so I became the de facto interpreter and translator for my parents, which I later learned in life is actually speaking multiple languages fluently is actually a privilege that I hold. Currently, I live in Oakland, California with my partner, who is a cisgender second generation Asian man who grew up very differently from me. And so we have a lot of conversations about socioeconomic class. We also have a lot of conversations about immigration. I have two dogs. Hanson, who is pictured above, is actually my service animal because I live with an invisible disability, which can be a privilege or not, depending on who I'm speaking with. And then Kobe at the bottom is my pandemic puppy. And so just wanted to share with you a little bit about Healing Equity United. And so Healing Equity United, we're a consulting firm. Fiona and I started this firm over 5 years ago after having been spent our entire careers in the nonprofit sector, and realized that, no matter how where we went to work in the US or what positions we held or what coalition meetings we sat in, that oftentimes we were the only people of color in that space, or we were the only women of color in that space. And so we set out to try to really infuse and change the culture of our sector and nonprofit organizations through diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work. And so some of the work that we do with nonprofits include providing direct consulting, executive coaching, trainings, as well as audits. But for today, what we're going to be talking about is really thinking about what's going on in our nonprofit sector, right? How did it become so not diverse and not as inclusive as we would like, right? When the very reality of the people that we're trying to serve oftentimes look different than the leadership of our organizations. We'll also talk about how white women might serve as gatekeepers in a nonprofit sector, and really think about what we might need to do, not just as people who, whether we identify as white, white presenting, or Black, Indigenous, people of color, global majority, but really understanding what are our roles in disrupting gatekeeping, and really understanding what to do when harmful norms show up in our sector. And so a couple of group agreements that we want you to keep in mind for today. So one is that there's no room for the oppression Olympics in this space. And that's really because what we know is that all oppression is tied, and therefore all liberation is tied. If I'm talking and focusing on one of my social identities that is rooted in oppression, I might not be able to see how others are affected by it, right? And so what we talk about is, let's come from a place where we can understand that we are all oppressed in different ways. We also cannot guarantee that this is going to be a safe space. And the reason for that is because we don't know if there's something that I might say, that Cassie or Fiona might say, that might not trigger something in you, right? That might not remind you of a painful experience that you might have been, right? And so what we're going to ask for is that we hold each other in a brave space, so that we can try to really accept that there might be challenging moments for us of learning, and to come to expect those, that we all have different lived experiences and perspectives. And it's important that when we're trying to engage in conversations like this, that we respect one another and we try to meet each other where we're at. It's okay to say it messy. Oftentimes, I was that kid growing up in school who never spoke in class because by the time I formulated the right sentence to say, it was 25 minutes after the teacher already asked the question. And so what we're saying today is it's okay for you to just say things messy. You don't have to worry about whether you have the right sentence structure. Just it's be free. Like just it's okay to just share as you are. And be okay with non-closure. We're not going to solve racism today, right? In this 1 hour webinar. I wish we could, but we're not, unfortunately. And I know that this work is going to continue. Also, if things are shared in the chat, we ask that you try to keep it confidential. What we often say is that what's said here stays here and what's learned here leaves here. There might be personal stories, incidences at work that others are sharing in the chat. We ask that you keep that confidential. And then lastly, please take care of yourself. So if you need to get up and get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, let the dog out because your dog is barking in your ear, feel free to do that. Do whatever you need to do to stay present.
Thank you, Jess. And so I just want to uplift before we get started. Unfortunately, in the webinar setting, participants cannot see the entire chat. So when you're sending something, that'll be going to us as hosts and panelists. But we love seeing where you all are zooming in from. And please feel free to continue to message in the chat. Also want to uplift that we'll be sending out the slides and recording to everyone who registered. So keep that in mind. And as we're moving along content, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. Yes. And actually, Jess just let me know. We updated the settings. And so you all will now be able to see each other's comments in the chat. So thanks for doing that, Jess. All right, so let's dive into the content. And we want to do that by starting off with a little poll. And so we're going to be doing a Mentimeter. And so I'm going to be dropping a link into the chat. And we'd love for you all to participate. When you click on that link, you'll see this question, and we love for you all just to share what your thoughts are. What do you think the percentage is of nonprofit leadership who identifies as white? And what we mean by that is nonprofit, executive directors and board chairs. Okay, so folks who are in particular those positions of power. So what is the percentage of nonprofit leadership who identify as white? We'll give folks a few more moments to put their guesses in. I see we've got about 70 folks who've participated so far. See, a majority of us are thinking maybe 90%. Some folks in the 80s, and then just a few people in the 60%. And so thank you all. It's okay if not everybody got to participate in this. We just wanted to take a pulse check and see what folks were thinking. And those who kind of fell in that 80 to 90% range were pretty correct. A little more than 80% of nonprofit leadership at this current moment identify as white. And specifically in terms of board members, almost 90% of board members identify as white within the US. And so we thought it was really important just to start off with that percentage because it's pretty striking, right? So thank you all for participating in that poll. And let's get into a little bit of the history. Those who might be history buffs will really enjoy this section. And those who may not be super into history, hang on, because we think this this kind of context is very important to thinking about how the profit sector is set up the way that it is in this current moment. So first and foremost, it's really challenging to summarize the vast history of the nonprofit sector, but we are going to pull out some noteworthy roots that have set the sector up to kind of perpetuate this white supremacy culture. And so first and foremost, I'm going to take us all the way back to thinking about colonial America, okay? And the US charitable sector, those of us might be surprised. I know when I found this out, I was very surprised, has roots in, we'll go all the way back to 1601. There's a British statute of charitable uses, which listed a broad range of charitable purposes that later shaped charitable practice in colonial America. And so this statute of charitable uses covered the relief of the aged, impotent, and poor people. It also included schools of learning and marriages of poor maids. British law provided the blueprint for a broadly defined charitable sector, and the US tax code reflects this in its heritage. And I think, from my opinion, we can also kind of tie this back to the nonprofit sector's kind of root in paternalism, right? Or that sense of paternalism that is so strong within nonprofits. Fast forward, I'm going to take y'all now to kind of the progressive era. So thinking about the 1920s, when social activism collided with a vast wealth growth in the United States. And this was also a time when organizations such as the YMCA were created, but they were often led by white women who are connected to wealthy families. And so the ways in which issues such as poverty, substance use disorders, child abuse, etc., were addressed were from the worldviews of those white wealthy women, right? Often not through lived experience, but from a privileged perspective. And I think that this could also tie and be a root of our tendency towards the white savior complex that we often see in nonprofits, right? I'm here to help XYZ poor community, these poor kiddos, these XYZ, right? Marginalized communities. I know what's best for them, right? Fast forward a little bit more. As the US entered the 1940s and World War II, people found it increasingly important to band together to serve communities in need. And during this time, the US government increased their involvement in the nonprofit sector by providing significant grant funding and contracts to organizations like the Red Cross, who were largely white-led due to Jim Crow laws during this time. And other policies that were made and put in place to signify Black Americans as second-class citizens, right? While these organizations served their communities in some important ways, they didn't address the underlying racist policies that Black folks often faced and perpetuated them, right? Thinking about, for example, maybe redlining practices that were very strong in the 40s and 60s, right? These organizations weren't actually addressing them and often were perpetuating them. Fast forward a little more, and now we're in the 60s and 70s. The US was going through the civil rights movement, and at the same time, we had the creation of the IRS tax code known as the 501c3 status. And this official nonprofit status in the IRS helped to solve the federal government's budget problems. In our history, some policymakers have called for cuts in spending on social services, assuming that the nonprofit sector can fill in those gaps, right? Which is ironic because the nonprofit sector often relies on that government support to provide the crucial social services and direct service support that they intend to offer communities, right? The civil rights movement exemplified that Black communities knew how to organize and to serve their communities, but were not given equal opportunity to do so. right? Black family families continued to lack access to public education, partially during this time because of white flight that was going on, right? Schools in cities would simply close instead of integrating during that time of white flight. During this time, also, the nonprofit sector, government programs, and orgs made it more difficult to serve BIPOC folks by creating unnecessary guidelines to receive services. And we continue to see some of these impacts in programs that are in use today, such as the temporary assistance for needy families, which creates a poverty cliff that's so steep that the program penalizes individuals as they strive towards economic sufficiency. And it's important to note, in terms of, and I mentioned this earlier, white savior complex. The white savior industrial complex is inherently wrapped up in all of this history that we just went over. For those who are unfamiliar, when we say the white savior industrial complex, this is referring to the institutional merging of practices and processes that validate white privilege. So, for example, enslavement is an example of this ideology. It reflects racial trauma that began over 400 years ago. In response to the race-based creation of privilege and oppression, slaveholders served as an intervention to provide basic needs and humanization, civility, and morality in exchange for the exploitation of labor. Following enslavement, the white savior industrial complex created institutions that were rewarded for saving the less fortunate while simultaneously engaging in policies and practices that maintain those systems of oppression, working people in that grind culture, right? And so this was a lot of history that I just went over in the last two slides. And I just want to reiterate that this doesn't depict the complete list of every historical marker that has played a role in why the nonprofit sector continues to be predominantly white and white-led. But these moments in history felt important for us to pull out and to explicitly name. And so shifting gears a little bit, why are we specifically talking about white women today, right? While we know that patriarchy can allow for white women to experience sexism in the sector, there are times that white women in particular can use feminism as a way to undermine issues of race, class, and other intersecting identity issues, right? Well, I experience sexism, so I understand the racism that you're going through, right? The number of times I think Jess, Fiona, and I have encountered instances of this with white women in positions of leadership, countless, right? It's also important to note, and why we're specifically pulling out white women as a population to focus on today is because women make up about 75% of nonprofit employees, with a very high percentage of these women identifying as white, right? And some studies found that over 80% of the nonprofit leadership jobs in our country go to white women in particular. So we have to acknowledge that these white women can be in positions as gatekeepers. And so what do we mean by gatekeepers? Gatekeepers are those who speak for, describe, translate, interpret, count, and determine institutional access for people of the golden majority, other marginalized identities in the process of systemic oppression, right? Perpetuating that systemic oppression, continuing to uphold and maintain white supremacy culture, right? Gatekeepers are typically accountable to their bosses and institutions rather than to the communities that they are intending to serve, right? Rather than the communities that the mission is intending to serve. And they usually help to maintain rather than to change the system, right? They're keeping status quo. Any kind of rock in the boat or change that is brought up is very uncomfortable for them, and they want to keep that status quo, right? They contribute to depriving oppressed people access to the institutions that control their lives and that impact their day-to-day. And I think it's really important to note in this conversation yes, we're focusing on white women as gatekeepers, but people of the global majority can most certainly also become gatekeepers once they are in positions of power and might subscribe to white supremacy culture or haven't done the work to unpack the white supremacy culture that they have internalized, right? So just important to note that. But as we continue our conversation, right, we're specifically speaking to white women leaders, okay? And I think it's important, as we're continuing to talk about this population, it's important to note that for white women in the nonprofit sector, just by holding the two identities, socialized or gender female and white, this lands a gatekeeping position in society that is state-sanctioned protection, right? White women have a lot of control and access to resources, knowledge, advancement based on those two identities, right? And again, knowing that a large percentage of those leadership positions, right, close to 80% of those leadership positions are going to white identified folks, huge percentage of those white women, we have to point out the obvious, right? We have to talk about that. The numbers don't lie. And so we see here this graph on the left. This is from a Race to Lead study. It was women of color in the nonprofit sector. This was done in 2019. And of the 4,000 nonprofit staff that were surveyed, they found that it is clear that there are persistent racial and gender biases that create barriers to advancement for women of color in particular within the nonprofit sector. Women of color reported being passed over for new jobs or promotions in favor of others, including men of color, white women, and white men with comparable or even lower credentials. Okay. So important to just kind of pull that out. And apologies, the graph is a little tiny. Again, we'll be sending out the slides afterwards, so you'll be able to kind of zoom in to see this a little more clearly. And so at this juncture, it's really important for us to pull out, when we're talking about white supremacy culture, what do we mean, right? What are those white supremacy culture characteristics that white women might be knowingly or unknowingly perpetuating while in that gatekeeping position, while in leadership positions? And so we want this slide here depicts the white supremacy cultural characteristics from Tima Okun. And if you haven't seen this resource, we highly suggest you checking it out. We will focus on a few of these that are specific to white women in leadership positions. But if you're looking for more content around all of these, please definitely check out this resource from Tima Okun. But the thing that we want to pull out here, and that is important of note, is that in order to uphold these white supremacy cultural characteristics of denial, defensiveness, progress is more, all of the ones that you see kind of in this image here, power hoarding and fear are necessary to uphold those, to perpetuate those, right? And I think it's also important to note at this juncture too that when we're talking about white supremacy culture, we are talking about the ideology or the idea of white supremacy culture, right? That white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of the global majority, their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. That is the culture that we're swimming in, right? And so when we're speaking to that, we're speaking about the ideology. And so, Fiona, I'm going to pass it over to you just to pull out a few of these white supremacy cultural characteristics that are very prevalent for white women in leadership positions.
Thank you, Cassie. And I see in the chat that you're getting a lot of love for providing the context and the history. So thank you for having done that. I think that when we are addressing some of the most prevalent white supremacy cultural values and characteristics that are facilitating how many white women are showing up in the nonprofit space, we have to focus on three. One is the power hoarding and gatekeeping, some of the gatekeeping that you've already talked about. The next one is urgency and perfectionism. And then the last one, of course, down there is fear of open conflict. Oh my goodness. There was even a book written about that. I think it's White Woman Tears. So let's get into it. So power hoarding and gatekeeping is like just the information and knowledge, and the access to information and knowledge is power. Gatekeeping through gossip or talking about your colleagues of the global majority, questioning their ability to do the work as effectively, or to be as impactful, is just as harmful, even though it is a subtle power hoarding move, right? um, Controlling the information and who has access to that information. So let's say that there is a meeting in which some really crucial decisions are going to be made, but then not sharing the date and time, location of that meeting with your colleagues of the global majority. The fact that, you are in that space and have access to those sort of power players, and your colleagues of the global majority do not, is a power move. We'll get to some ways to mitigate this, but I'll just give one example. When I was working at a nonprofit in New York, one thing that one of the white co-executive directors did intentionally was to bring me into um, very influential spaces and meetings, even though my job description on paper or my quote unquote role didn't call for it, right? So we always have to be thinking about how we're showing up in terms of power hoarding, how we're showing up in terms of gatekeeping. The next one is urgency and perfectionism, and that's tied to martyrdom and white saviorism. And so the idea that your worth is dependent on how helpful you can be can really turn into over-controlling dynamics and micromanaging. Oh my goodness. Reaching down into your colleagues of the global majorities, how they send the email, the wording of the email. Did they do what they said they were going to do? Now they have to take time out of their day to prove to you that they did what they said they were going to do or should have done, right? That's requiring perfectionism. That's requiring a level of interference that serves no one, quite frankly. But the underlying premise could be, oh, I was just trying to be helpful. I just wanted to make sure I was doing what's best to serve the mission. But unfortunately, that can lead to burnout for those who are the target and recipients of your quote unquote helpfulness, right? That helpfulness is really about perfectionism. Let's see, I want to get to some more of the content. So let me just switch on over to a fear of open conflict. Now, this one right here, if I could do a sermon on this, I would, but we don't have enough time. So the fear of open conflict, particularly with white women that show up in the nonprofit sector, many of them, not all, okay, not all, don't come at me, is that females are socialized not to rock the boat. And sometimes this might be rooted in the fear of saying the wrong thing, but it can also perpetuate harm and silence, right? So when people of the global majority or colleagues of the global majority want to challenge the status quo, it is often perceived as a personal attack, right? And then the tears come, and then the focus shifts to those who are crying versus the matter at hand that needs to be modified, mitigated, undone. Okay, and so we want our white sibs in positions of leadership, in particular in nonprofit sector, to be mindful of how the fear of open conflict shows up in the workplace, right? And does that fear of open conflict become more problematic or become more of the focus than the harms of oppression playing out in the workplace, right? And whose feelings are we valuing? So let's move on to the next one. Can you switch slides, please? Thank you. Okay, so Cassie, can you read that for me, please? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So we want to shift gears, right? And I saw a question about this in the Q&A too, right? So what do we do about this? Fiona just went over, some of the really insidious ways that white supremacy culture is perpetuated, particularly by white women in leadership. We saw lots of emojis go up. We saw lots of comments in the chat. Folks have seen this. This is real, right? It's happening in our organizations. And so in this next section, we want to talk about the ways in which white women in particular can change their ways, right? And maybe instead of being in a space of gatekeeping, move to a space of liberated gatekeeping, right? Using their power and privilege and access to opportunity to break down the gates, right? Having that awareness of the system's policies and people that are creating those barriers. And have a realization that we are all gatekeepers in some way if we're holding an identity that brings us power, right? So how can white women use their gatekeeping to check other people's privilege, right? And so some action steps for white folks on the call, right? Acknowledge that you have that gatekeeping status. Acknowledge that this brings you this identity brings you power. This position brings you power, right? The combination of your feminine identity and white identity are bringing you power. Take moments to call in other white women who are your colleagues who haven't done that work, right? Do it with love, do it with care, but call them in, right? Help them to see that they might be causing some harm so that your BIPOC colleagues don't have to. Your colleagues of other marginalized identities don't have to do that work, right? Find spaces to heal from any harm and move from that space of feeling like victim, right? Oh, I've experienced sexism. I've experienced XYZ related to my feminine identity to a space of empowerment, right? We talk about this all the time, like hurt people hurt people. So if white folks that are on the call are not taking the time to do that healing, you might continue to perpetuate some of that harm because you haven't taken the time to heal yourself, right? It's so important. That's important for all of us to take the time to heal, right? You don't need to, we're not here to say white women get out of the way, get out of these positions of power. You don't need to exit the organization by any means, but become an active member on the sideline. And what we mean by that is if you don't need to be the person who is holding the mic or leading the charge in terms of whatever might be going on at your organization that is impacting those who are closest to the work or those who are in the community that you're trying to serve, then move to the sideline and or bring them to the table, then move to the sideline, right? Don't make it about you. Yeah. Cultivate a culture of feedback that is rooted in care. And again, I think this is highly attached to taking the time to heal. If you are not taking that time to heal, you are going to be in that space of denial and defensiveness when someone is trying to give you feedback, especially when, potentially a BIPOC identified person might be trying to give you some feedback, right? we need to, and this, in general, I think as a sector, we need to get to a place where feedback can be more normalized, right? It's not such a scary thing for us to bring up. It is a normal thing that is happening in our day-to-day, that we are calling in each other with love, or given both the positive and maybe more constructive feedback on a regular basis, so that it's not so nerve-wracking when it needs to come up, right? And those of us who might be in, and I think this is very strong in nonprofits and the nonprofit sector in general, but particularly I saw a number of us might be calling in from the Pacific Northwest area. Our Anglo-Saxon norm of communication, of passive aggression and conflict avoidance is so strong, right? The Seattle nice, those of us who might be in the greater Seattle area, we need to move past that. It is harming everyone when we operate out of that place of passive aggression and maybe sweeping things under the rug and not addressing them, right? And so those are just a few action steps that we can think of, but we want to hear from you all. Okay. What else? What other external actions can white women in the nonprofit sector take? And so we're going to do this through Mentimeter. And so I will drop that link again in the chat. If you still have that Mentimeter link open, that is the same link that we're going to be using. So you can just hit that refresh button, and it'll bring you to the new page. So what other external actions can white women in the nonprofit sector take? I'm going to give folks a few moments to open up that link. And once we've got some responses, we will share that. All right. So what other external actions can white women in the nonprofit sector take? Listen more than we speak, keep learning, be open to new perspectives, stand beside and hold space for other voices, simply listening, stop taking the mic. Again, active listening, ask questions, elevate voices that are silenced, reach out to local land back initiative organizations to see how they can further their commitment on local level. Continue educating ourselves, books, podcasts, movies, consuming media that shares authentic experiences. Pause before jumping in. Sit back at meetings, don't always be the one to speak. Allow others to. Stop questioning the leadership of women of color. Be curious, keep learning. Sponsor BIPOC, speak up for it, and about them often. Implement inclusive hiring practices, and then support and mentor folks when they are on the team. Set the tone when giving voice to POC. Stop micromanaging. Name the privilege in open spaces. Invite people to call you in. Hold fellow white women, friends, colleagues, etc. accountable for actual allyship and not demonstrative allyship, right? The performative stuff. Yeah. Challenge yourself on decentering. Be open to dialogue. Examine our internal practices and how they were developed, why they were developed, and who was part of developing them with a commitment to co-develop policies and procedures. Stop being defensive when someone shares the harm you have caused. Yes, I'm seeing so many really great responses in here, and we'll be sharing out the responses with the slide deck so that you all will be able to have access to these. I think at this point, we want to maybe shift into the Q&A.
One other thing before we do the shifting into Q&A, I
Yeah.
didn't hear it specifically named, but another action that our white colleagues and nonprofit organizations can do is to mindfully acknowledge when their colleagues of the global majority are the sacrificial lamb, right? And so when it's a choice between being aligned with whiteness and maintaining the benefits and privileges associated with whiteness, or really holding fast in terms of equity and anti-oppression and advancing and meeting the needs of their colleagues of the global majority, we find that more and more folks are siding with the whiteness. And so a huge action to take is to be mindful of that dynamic and that tension, and strategically and purposefully align yourself with anti-oppression and equity. Let's get into the Q&A. Jess.
Cassie, you want to stop screen sharing? All right, so there's a question here. First one, it's about grappling with women of color who have fully embraced assimilation and white supremacy ideals. What have participants found to be the best ways to approach these cases?
Fiona?
So the question is about, look, many things can be true at the same time. And what we often find is that BIPOC women in leadership who have embraced white supremacy ideals and characteristics and values did it for a reason. They did it to advance in their careers. They did it to because that's what had to be done in order to maintain their livelihoods. And so there's a time and place for that. At this point, for me, we have to let that go. We have to show up as our authentic selves and not feel like we have to assimilate in order to be valued. I can show up as Fiona, authentically Fiona, and be valued for everything that I bring to the table. But yeah, that's a reality that there are some women of color who have internalized all of those values and ideals.
And what about women of color who haven't internalized it and see it? Like, how can women of color interrupt this cycle if white women don't see it?
Well, that is a far more nuanced question than I think we have time for. The couple of things come to mind, and then Cassie, I would love for you to jump in. One, I don't know that I want to put all of the burden of that work on the shoulders of women of color, right? I'd rather shift um, the work to our white colleagues to be able to raise awareness for themselves, identify, and then interrupt those dynamics. But two, if that is not the case, then having power in numbers. So our colleagues of the global majority getting together and sharing all of their concerns or the dynamics that they're noting, and sharing that with leadership. And it's then not just one person's problem or issue. It is a whole host of folks who are coming to the table, who are noting these things. And then the third one I will say, and then Cassie, please jump in, is that not every place is for you. And so if you can, find a way to exit stage right, to an organization that will value you and is actively trying to interrupt and dismantle all of these systems we're talking about. Cassie?
Yes, Fiona, you hit the nail on the head. I was going to get to that place, but I think in particular, getting to that first question about women of color who have fully embraced assimilation and are following along with those white supremacy ideals. I've had success in starting a conversation from a place of a trusted relationship. Right. I have a relationship with this person. I know them on a human level. And then I've taken the opportunity to call them in with love, or call upon them with love, right? And specifically talk to the ways in which their actions or their words have impacted me as a fellow woman of color, right? And I find that in those conversations where we're calling in with love, that creates an opportunity for a conversation, right? And hopefully could potentially mitigate some of that defensiveness, right? And sometimes that's inevitable. And if you get to a place, as Fiona mentioned, where you've tried to have that conversation and it's come from a place of love and care for this person and using I statements and how it's impacted you, and they still can't hear that, maybe that is not the right relationship for you. Maybe that is not the right space for you, the right team for you, whatever it might be. Just consider what your options are at that point. And so Jess, I know we're running low on time here. I know we didn't get a chance to get to all of the amazing questions that we saw here in the Q&A, but we want to just take some time to share out. We have another free webinar that is coming up and definitely is linked to some of the questions that we saw here in the Q&A, right? Can the oppressed uphold oppressive structures, right? And so this next conversation will particularly kind of address, folks who are people of the global majority who have assimilated and who might be internalizing some of those white supremacy cultural characteristics and continue to, perpetuate that. And so we hope that you all will join us. Please register over Eventbrite and follow up that Zoom registration to get the link. And we will share that out in the chat. Thank you all so much for being here. Just drop the link for our next webinar, so please feel free to grab that. And again, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the slides, recording, and some of the resources that were named in the chat today. Thank you all so much for being here for our conversation today.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.